Hello there everybody and welcome to my review of Synapse for PlayStation VR 2. TLDR, it's okay. It's a better game than Fracked, but that's not saying much. It's a promising game on the surface, but does absolutely nothing with any of the potential it holds. Every single problem I had with Fracked is also present here, except for the roguelike elements that make the gameplay loop a tiny bit more fun. You could do a lot worse than this, but it's still disappointing how this game is basically Fracked, copy-pasted onto the PlayStation 5 with an Instagram filter. If that's good enough for you, then buy this game. But it wasn't good enough for me. It's barely passable, and I have no desire to play this game after this review is finished. And now, here is my full review. After the horrible disappointment that was Fracked, I wasn't expecting much out of Synapse. However, after playing it a bunch, I can safely say that it's better than Fracked, but not by much. It's still plagued by a lot of the same problems, and I mean the exact same problems. I was fairly impressed with the game's trailers prior to release, but as soon as I started watching the preview footage of this game from other creators, I quickly started to see how similar this game was to its predecessor. I saw a ton of red flags that indicated to me that there weren't that many changes done to the established formula. Considering how much I didn't enjoy Fracked, I was afraid that I was simply going to get the same game again, but with nicer graphics. Initially, I didn't mind this, because the first few minutes of this game were genuinely very fun. However, as I delved deeper, the more the game lost its luster as it gave way to unlearned mistakes and wasted potential. I'm sad to say that most of what I predicted came true. Synapse is in fact just Fracked again. The exact same game copy-pasted onto the PlayStation 5, but with a roguelike mod attached to it. The weapons are mostly the exact same. The cover system is the same. The enemies and the way the story is handled is identical to its predecessor. And naturally, the problems that come with those things are also fully intact here. Let us do away with this introduction, and let's just get into the meat of it, shall we? First off, I would like to acknowledge the positives this game has, which ironically have little to do with the game itself and more with the platform it was released in, the PlayStation VR 2 headset. All of the headset's features are represented and well implemented here, from the lens's higher resolution and higher frame rate contributing to the immersion into the game's atmosphere, to even the haptic feedback and headset vibration when engaged in combat. The haptic triggers in particular are great, since they make your weapons feel better to use and make the telekinesis system a little deeper by adding different effects to the level of pressure you put onto them. And speaking of telekinesis, let's talk about the eye tracking, which I think is easily the most impressive part of this game. You have the option to target objects with your eyes, and then move them around with your hands. One would assume that this would be awkward and difficult to get used to, but it really wasn't the case. I was shocked at how quickly the eye tracking became second nature to my navigation of menus and selecting objects. I didn't even have to think about it most of the time. I just looked at something, grabbed it, and threw it with surprising fluidity. It created a unique kind of flow to the shooting that feels very different from other games, and proves to be quite fun when you get the hang of it. The fact that it came so naturally to me is a great compliment to what's possible in VR games, and it's easily the most impressive part of playing Synapse. It's easy to say that when it comes to technology and visual fidelity, Synapse feels like a massive upgrade from nDreams' older VR titles, and I appreciate it a lot. The graphics do look very nice, and part of me wishes that we could spend more of our time in the real world, where there's actual color, as opposed to the grayscale world that composes 99% of your time here. The reason for this is due to the story, where you play a faceless, nameless agent that needs to infiltrate someone's brain for information that your superiors need in order to avoid a terrorist attack. Inside this person's brain, there are mind soldiers that want to stop you, and so you engage in a roguelike experience where you shoot people in arenas until you're the last man standing. You proceed to the next level and keep doing this over and over until the game ends. The same cover system from Fracked is also present here, and it's still just as good as it was before. In fact, I would say it's better, because now it's evolved to a general climbing mechanic, where not only can you push and pull yourself in and out of cover, but you can also grab onto basically anything and climb up it, which can be useful from time to time. Even if you're holding a gun on one hand, the game will automatically tell when you're trying to climb, so it'll just let you climb with both hands regardless. When I reviewed Fracked, I mentioned that the cover system only worked because of the older hardware that the game was on. But now with PlayStation VR 2, you have analog sticks, and so here, I was kind of expecting to get into cover by just moving around and crouching. But they did change the cover system in a way where it justifies its existence yet again by allowing you to climb around. Reloading is also fast and easy to do. You just push the magazine back into the gun and you're ready to go. In Fracked, you had to do this by hand. But here you can push the magazine with any surface within the game. This means you can hit your gun onto a rock and even use your own body and it'll work. I much prefer this than trying to go all realistic with it and having to reload your gun manually like most other games. Not here. I just tap my big ol' fat belly and I'm loaded up again. And speaking of loading, the game itself loads incredibly fast. I remember that when the PlayStation 5 first launched, that was one of the bigger selling points, to be able to jump into a game with blazing speed. However, that is something that's been talked about less and less as time went on, probably because people got used to that speed and don't notice it anymore. Or maybe it's just a topic that's been talked about before, so people don't feel like they need to mention it again. But here, I noticed it right away, especially when moving from one level to the other. It's damn near instant, and it gives people a good motivator to immediately jump back in and play again, knowing that it takes no time to do so. And that, in a nutshell, is what Synapse is. A fairly simple gameplay loop, but it's one that works relatively well and scratches that itch for a game that makes you say, oh, just one more run and I'm done. Of course, because the game follows a roguelike structure, it'll be pretty challenging early on. You'll die a bunch of times, but slowly get stronger with each run, until it becomes easier and faster to reach the ending stages of the game. Even if you do beat it, you'll be challenged even further with subsequent playthroughs as the game gets harder and harder, honing your skills even more and getting even more upgrades on the way. This all sounds well and good on paper, but my problems begin even before I finish my first playthrough. I already mentioned this before, but I'll say it again and with no exaggeration. Every single problem that Fracked had that brought down my experience significantly, this game also has. I apologize if this part of the video feels like a copy and paste of my Fracked review, but I think that way I can properly convey the point I'm trying to make about Synapse. If it feels like you've already heard this review before, then good, because that's what I'm trying to get you to see about the game I'm reviewing. Oh, and spoilers incoming for the late game, but don't worry too much about it, because you're honestly not missing much, and in some cases, there is literally nothing here for you to even miss out on in the first place. The first thing I want to point out is that the game is extremely short, disappointingly so for a roguelike. Even with all the times I died and had to restart, I beat my first playthrough in just over a couple of hours, with an incredibly abrupt and unsatisfying ending, where it basically just cuts to black and goes, "Awesome, you beat the game. Now play it again on hard," like it's a fucking NES game from the 1980s or something. It doesn't help that there's no final boss either. That's right, the final level that they hype up during the whole playthrough is just a long level with a ton of enemies in it, and then it's over. If you saw my review of Vertigo 1, you'll know that I started compiling a list of 10 commandments of shooting games, with one of them being, thou shalt not have your final level just be a room full of enemies. Please have an actual final boss, please. The ending of this game felt like when you reach the center of the universe in No Man's Sky. The center of the universe gets super hyped up, but when you actually get there, it just pulls you all the way back to the beginning of the game. This is no different. The characters talking in your ear are like, you gotta get to the subconscious, you have to, if you want to save the world, the subconscious is where you need to be, all of our problems will be over when you get to the subconscious, and then you get there and it's just a room that spams the same 4 enemies at you just like always, and at the end, is just a door that sends you back to the beginning of the game. Who the actual hell thought that was a good idea? And yes, I know that the vast majority of roguelikes work like this. You do a playthrough with a certain kind of run, and then you start all over again and you do the game differently, but it just doesn't work here. And I'll get to that very soon. And no, I don't care that this is not the actual ending. You can't just have a wet fart of a conclusion and be like, oh yeah, if you do the exact same shit again, but more annoying this time, 2 more times, then you'll get the real ending. Well, I doubt that most people will be motivated to bother. When people see the credits roll, most people are like, okay, so we're done, right? But no, it's not over. And I have a laundry list of reasons for why myself and anyone else wouldn't want to go through all that trouble. The lack of variety is a big one. There are other VR roguelikes like the Light Brigade that also have a short runtime. but it's fun to play through it over and over again because there's different classes, randomly generated levels, and the enemy AI gets smarter and have more tools in their arsenal, just like how you have more tools in your arsenal. Then there's other games like Hades that give you a multitude of options and challenges for every run. Adding to that, the story, which is constantly giving you something new with even the tiniest of changes. In Synapse, there is no such thing. The weapon variety is very similar to Fracked in that there's barely any. Pistol, machine gun, shotgun, grenade launcher, and that's it, and you can only hold 2 of them at a time. There are different tiers of those weapons that make them stronger, but ultimately it's the same weapon with slightly higher stats. The enemies that you use your guns on are also not varied at all. In fact, they are the exact same enemies as the ones in Fracked, but instead of being purple, they're gray now. The normal guy that shoots and throws grenades at you, the suicide bomber that runs towards you, and the big guy. There's a 4th guy that flies around, but that's about it. There aren't any bosses to speak of either. There's the big guy that you fight that becomes a regular enemy in the future, so you'll get used to seeing that big guy so often that it won't even feel like a boss anymore. Even on the higher difficulty levels where you'll be upgraded so much that you're basically unstoppable at that point. It ends up becoming a super repetitive experience to the point that the graphics and mechanics lose their luster very quickly. It's extremely disappointing seeing so much old stuff getting recycled for this new game, especially with the way that they set up the story. You're supposed to be exploring the inside of someone's brain, but you only see the same boring gray area with 2 enemies, and the occasional 3rd and even more occasional 4th. The visual style is cool at first, but it gets super boring and uninteresting to look at after a while. Everything is gray with neon colors used to highlight important items. Explosions and lava are a different color, but that's it. The maps aren't varied enough either. They're all the same, but placements are rearranged when you start a new run. So every time you go into a new level, you're just standing in a different position, and all of the healing and upgrade stations are placed in different areas as well. But that's it. Everything is the same. I think randomly generated levels would have been much better, because I very quickly got tired of playing the same levels over and over again, especially playing through that one stupid level that's nothing but suicide bombers running at you until it's over. For some reason, that was always the 2nd level that I would play, and I got sick of it so quickly. You'd think there would be more creative and crazy scenarios for something like this. People's brains should look like Imagination Land from South Park, but this dude is apparently the most creatively bankrupt person in the world, and can only think about a tiny amount of levels and a couple of generic dudes running around it in grayscale. You get told that the person whose mind you're infiltrating is reacting to you, but you barely notice that. There's no real change in the scenery or reactions to story development. You completely forget that you're inside someone's mind because barely anything is done with that concept, other than making everything gray. Which reminds me, the story is not interesting whatsoever. They're basically playing a military-themed audiobook or a radio drama in your head while you play. You as a player don't do anything special other than to progress with the levels and then be told that you're doing a great job in uncovering the information needed to save the world. But nothing is shown, only told to you. The story was so uninteresting that it didn't motivate me to get the true ending if all that meant was to go through all that trouble just to unlock a few more voice lines from this terrible podcast that this game considers a story. Things are definitely happening, guys. There's bombs, big bombs, and bad things will happen for sure if you don't do something. Can you see any of it? No, but like, trust me, bro, all of it is super real and very important. There's no creative visuals happening on that front, like showing you the world that you're trying to protect or the story from the villain's perspective and how he became the way that he is. Nothing, just run around and shoot the same dude over and over and over again while occasionally listening in on the most boring Discord call in the world between 2 people that only imply that things are happening somewhere in the world. Definitely, surely there must be. Despite the talented voice actors being featured, the performances come off as super flat and unexciting. They all sound bored to be there, and even David Hayter, with the occasional solid Snake voice he puts on, doesn't do much for me either. He just goes, something is wriggling around my mind, and it just, I don't know, it just doesn't really do anything for me. The voice acting on part of the enemies is particularly annoying as well. They just never shut up. They just yell the same few lines over and over again about the non-believer or whatever, and they death scream in this unfitting, cheesy way every time I kill them. It's like the developers only recorded like 3 screaming lines and a few taunting lines, and then just recycled them for the whole game. They sound like henchmen from a Saturday morning cartoon, and it just sounds weird and ill-fitting. The fact that I have to hear that constantly the entire game gets pretty grating. It just made me want to kill them faster so I could hear them less. And speaking of killing them quickly, let's talk a little bit more about the game's mechanics, the telekinesis in particular. Although the telekinesis is fun at first, there's not a whole lot to it, and it's actually a lot more limited than it looks. In the tutorial, they basically spoil everything that you can do without any more space to do more complex things. Which is ironic when considering how many times the game mentions that doing creative kills benefits you. I guess that means blowing up barrels with your mind 1,000,000 times until you reach the arbitrary milestone that you need in order to rack up more upgrade points. And yeah, you can get those points by essentially just doing milestone stuff, which is super boring and not all that creative. Kill this enemy 5 times, kill this enemy 10 times, kill this enemy 30 times, do this trick 10 times, hit an enemy with a run grenade 30 times, and then do this other thing 50 times. Okay, now do it 100 times, and it's just like that over and over again. It's just not interesting. Psychic powers are cool, but it barely scratches the surface of what could be possible. You can move objects around, you can move the enemies and some platforms, and that's it. There's a lot of missed opportunities, especially when thinking about upgrades you could have gotten. Maybe it would have been cool to use other things as projectiles, like rocks in the environment, boxes of ammo, you could wash enemies away with water or lava, maybe even throw all the healing and upgrade stations at the enemies after you're done using them. Or hell, maybe even have an upgrade where you can stop bullets and push them back or something. Maybe do the telekinesis on yourself and catapult yourself far away instead of using an elevator or climbing. How about moving walls or the floor or move entire buildings like what happens towards the end? Just let people go crazy with it, you know? There's the big guy with armor and you can destroy the armor with your telekinesis. How about having an upgrade where if you hold an enemy in the air really hard, you can just crush them? And you can feel the effect of it by giving you more resistance on the triggers on your controller. I don't know, it's just every time I play this game, I keep thinking about what could have been outside of just the super basic throw explodey thing at enemy and just call it a day. This mechanic reminds me of Star Wars: The Force Unleashed, an old PlayStation 3 game from years ago. And I feel like Synapse is on the same level as that old game in terms of how the Force powers are treated. I might even dare say that the old-ass Star Wars game had more to offer than what Synapse did. The problems don't stop there, unfortunately, because it doesn't take many upgrades for your telekinesis powers to leave you incredibly overpowered. Basically, the moment you get the upgrade that lets you pick up enemies and throw them, you're pretty much untouchable. It's way too easy to overpower enemies and forget that you can even shoot enemies with a gun because you'll be too busy throwing enemies around like rag dolls or throwing explosives at them. And as I said before, you'll be doing this a lot because you need to beat the game 3 times before getting the true ending, which I found super annoying, especially when I felt like I was super done with this game after beating it the first time. And even if you do beat it the other 3 times, your full playthrough doesn't even go beyond 4 hours. So even with doing all this repetitive stuff, the experience is generally still very short. And the story wasn't interesting enough to warrant such an effort other than wanting to get more out of the money I spent to play this. The higher difficulty levels in later playthroughs ironically feel a lot easier than the early game, because by that point you're super decked out with all the maxed out upgrades that barely anything can touch you anymore. You're basically only playing to see how the story ends, which isn't interesting at all to begin with, so there really isn't much point in playing anymore and suffering through annoying enemies after you've run out of upgrades. This is what I'm saying when I mean that although the game is fun at first and everything should technically work on paper, it just doesn't the moment you try to look for anything deeper beyond the surface level and beyond the 30-minute mark. After playing the game myself, I can't see myself agreeing with all the other YouTubers that got flown out to get an early look at the game, saying that it's a must-buy and that it's one of the best PSVR 2 games ever, that it's a total game changer, and I just don't see it. The technology present in the PSVR 2 headset certainly elevates the experience. That's what I would call the game changer. But ultimately, the game itself doesn't do anything that's truly new and exciting, and it does more to recycle old content than anything else. It's like somebody that buys a brand new state-of-the-art cell phone, only for them to play Angry Birds for the 10 millionth time, but swearing on their life that it's a brand new game and not the same repetitive slop that they played on their older phone. That doesn't mean that Angry Birds is the game changer. The phone that you're playing it on is a game changer, but not the content of the game itself, because at the end of the day, it's still just Angry Birds. To wrap up this review, I think Synapse is generally a better game than Fracked, but only slightly. The game is so identical to Fracked in its flaws that it almost feels like someone made a really elaborate fan mod for Fracked, where they made it gray and added roguelike elements to it. Otherwise, it's almost the exact same game in both its successes and failures. I can't say that I was disappointed with Synapse because all my expectations got knocked down a peg after playing Fracked. All I can say is that although this game is a small improvement from its predecessor, I still came out of it fairly underwhelmed and unimpressed with the baffling levels of complacency found in the full package. There's some parts here that are worth complimenting, like the eye tracking in combination with the telekinesis, the headset vibration and haptic feedback. But even then, the majority of those compliments belong to the platform that it's on, rather than the content of the game itself. That's like giving a song on the radio a really high score just because you were listening to it on a really nice new car, or calling someone a good person because they bought brand new clothes. Well, no, that song is still the same song you've been listening to a million times, and it won't change it just because you played it on a nicer car. And that person that you know is still the same person no matter what brand of clothing they're wearing. And so, I can't call Synapse a great game just because the PlayStation VR 2 headset carries most of the experience. It only allows it to just barely cross the threshold to pass itself off as an above-average game. If I did review scores, and I went as far as to use decimals like some people do, this would be somewhere along the lines of a 5.999999 and just a bunch of nines going out infinitely out of 10. It's so extremely close to achieving the goal of just being a little bit more than okay. And even then, I wouldn't be able to say that with full confidence. I don't think Synapse is a bad game, but I don't think it's a great game either. It just barely passes as good. And honestly, I'm gonna have a very hard time getting excited for another End Dreams title in the future. Because it's as the saying goes, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And when End Dreams decides to work on a third VR shooting game, I guarantee you I will not be fooled a third time. I'll be taking my money and my time somewhere else.